So welcome everyone. I'm Erica Benson. I'm the Interim Director of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. And I want to say hi to our folks online too and apologize for the technical difficulties that we had last week. Hope things are up and running well this week. So this is our third faculty staff forum of the semester. And we have our talk scheduled through November 16th. So we hope that you will join us every Wednesday, whether it be in person or online. I want to give special thanks to Max Clark, our graduate assistant in the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, who has organized these talks and is also facilitating the live streaming, and also to Kelly Austin from CEDL, who is always here to help us get set up, and to CEDL for providing this space for us. So the title of our talk today is, you can see behind me, the economic progress of Hmong refugees in the United States. And as you all know, this topic hits pretty close to home for us because Minnesota and Wisconsin are among the top 3 states with the largest Hmong population in the United States. Of course, California is first. And Hmong people also make up the 5th largest cultural groups in both Minnesota and Wisconsin. So as I said, this hits close to home for us. Our presenter today is Dr. Wayne Carroll. He is a professor in economics and public health and environmental studies department. So he's in 2 departments. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carroll.
Thank you for coming. I've been looking forward to having a chance to talk about this topic. This is a topic, of course, that I love studying. I've been interested in this for a long time, and I'm very happy to share this. I presume that everybody here knows a lot about the Hmong diaspora because this is a part of our community. You know that after the Vietnam War, many thousands of refugees fled from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Hmong refugees came from the highlands of Laos. Many of them crossed across the Mekong River into Thailand, where they spent time in refugee camps. And so here we have a quick view of the journey that a lot of Hmong refugees completed, from remote mountains in Laos to refugee camps. One authoritative source says that the average stay in refugee camps in Thailand for Hmong refugees was about 7 years. And then they came to the U.S. We want to study these immigrants. Background here, of course, the setting here is that, the U.S. is very much a nation of immigrants. I love thinking about all these immigration stories that we have in U.S. history. Italians and Russians and Germans and Poles and Japanese immigrants and so on and so forth. And Hmong Americans are taking their place in this story. Now, when we talk about Hmong Americans in the U.S., we really have to think about this very broadly. And I've stolen here a little list from the Hmong Studies Journal that touches on some important topics in Hmong studies. Hmong Studies Journal says the important topics are education for Hmong Americans, gender identity issues, health disparities issues, linguistics, literary analysis. There are lots of accounts written by Hmong refugees about their experience, and fascinating stuff. These are topics that people in Hmong studies usually study. What's missing here? We don't really see anything in this kind of standard list from the Hmong Studies Journal about economics or about socioeconomic issues. And with my research, I've tried to fill that gap somewhat. So what I'm going to talk about here is some research I've done with colleagues, where we're looking at the socioeconomic status of Hmong refugees, Hmong Americans in the U.S., trying to fill in that gap in the research. And I need to mention that I've worked on this with a colleague, David Schaefer, who unfortunately decided to retire. It's always a tragedy for us when somebody retires. I guess maybe good for him. But I loved working with David, and he should get credit for a whole lot of the success I've had with this research. Also worked with students on this research for 15 or 20 years, 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 students each year. So, many thanks to them. Now, we're looking at socioeconomic status of Hmong Americans here. We're going to look at some data. The nature of the story I can tell is largely driven by the nature of the data, what the data offer. Data that we have here come from the U.S. Census Bureau. You know that the Census Bureau, used to be every 10 years, well, still I guess every 10 years, would ask everybody to fill out a little form. The Census Bureau also asks a sample of Americans to fill out what's known as the long form. Hundreds of questions, details about the lives of these individuals and families and households. Out of the long form data, the Census Bureau creates a sample. They take away any identifying information so that the information is confidential, and they share the data with researchers. The data goes to a group at the University of Minnesota called IPUMS that does wonderful things with the data. They take these huge census data files, they standardize the variables across years, and they make it really easy for researchers like me and like David to access the data. So we have data from IPUMS. We have 5% population samples from the 1980, 1990, 2000 decennial census. Census Bureau has been doing the long form as part of the American Community Survey annually since 2001. So we have a bunch of data from that. The data are wonderful. If you like numbers, boy, this is like dying and going to heaven. This is a wonderful thing. Just a quick look at what IPUMS can offer here. Here on the IPUMS website. It's not showing up here. Well, let me just describe what I see here on my screen. You go to the IPUMS website where you can choose variables. If you're looking at variables for individuals, they offer variables of demographic information, age, and things like that. Race, ethnicity, nativity. Where were they born? How long have they been in the U.S.? Education. How much education? What kind of education? Currently in school. Work. What's their occupation? How long have they been in that job? Are they unemployed? Income. What's their wage income? What's their public assistance income? What's their Social Security income? All kinds of things. Migration. Have they moved recently? Households. Information on where they're living. Household income. Even information, which I haven't gotten into, on what appliances they have in the household. Do they have a phone in the household? Do they have electricity in the household? Do they have Wi-Fi connection? We have hundreds of variables here. It's just amazing what IPUMS offers. So we have lots and lots of data. We pooled this sample. I've got observations on 80 million people from 1980 to 2018. And this includes information on about 47,000 Hmong Americans. We got information about 900 of them in 1980, 5,000 in 1990, 9,000 in the year 2000, and about 2,000 people each year from 2001 to 2018. So we got a big sample. And about each of these people, we have something like 300 variables. So lots and lots of data. Now, question that arises here, that's an interesting question. Okay, in the data, how are we going to decide which people are Hmong? Well, there are different variables that can help us here. The Census Bureau asks us to identify our race. White, black, Asian. If you say that you're Asian, then you have an opportunity to specify a detailed race. And somebody could say, well, my race is Hmong, Asian and Hmong. Census Bureau also asks about ancestry. How would you describe your ancestry? Irish, Italian, what? People can identify their ancestry as Hmong. Census Bureau asks about language spoken at home. Do you speak English at home? If not, what language do you speak at home? People can say, well, we speak Hmong at home. Now, if anybody says their race is Hmong, or their ancestry is Hmong, or language spoken at home is Hmong, I'm calling them Hmong. If they identify as Hmong in any one of these three factors, we're going to say they're a Hmong American. Now, what does our sample look like? From other data sources, we've created a little chart here, estimates of how many Hmong refugees came to the U.S. each year. Starting 1975, the end of the Vietnam War, we see that a lot of Hmong refugees came to the U.S. Around 1980, got a peak there. About 10 years later, we got another peak in the number of Hmong refugees. And then, 2004, 2005, when refugee camps in Thailand closed down, we got a last wave of Hmong refugees. So these are the people we want to study here. Now, what can we say about these refugees? Well, let's look at what the literature says about the economics of immigrant assimilation. For the last 50 years, economists have looked a lot at immigrants and their progress in the U.S. We got two chief insights from the economics literature on this. One insight is that how people do economically depends a lot on their human capital. Human capital refers to education, language skills, work experience, things like that. If somebody has more human capital, they're likely to get a better job, have higher wages, higher family income, and so on. So that's one important thing we get. Another thing we get is that there's a difference between refugees and other immigrants. Some immigrants come to the U.S. to get better job opportunities. They're not refugees. They come because they think they can get a good job and have a better career here. Those people tend to be self-selected. They come here because they're going to take advantage of opportunities. They tend to get higher incomes when they come to the U.S. Refugees, on the other hand, are not self-selected. Refugees are just fleeing from hardship, and they're not self-selected. They're going to tend to have lower incomes at first than economic immigrants. But studies by economists have said that their incomes tend to grow faster over time after they get here. So what is this going to say about Hmong refugees? Well, we got to look at their human capital that they bring. They're refugees. We would expect that, maybe after they come here, they're going to have rapid growth and economic progress. These predictions are captured by this chart from 40 years ago, created by an economist, where looking at years since somebody migrates, comes to the U.S., we expect people's incomes to go up. Refugees start off lower, but then grow rapidly from there. That's what we might expect. So, what about human capital for Hmong refugees? What do we see in terms of human capital for Hmong refugees? How much human capital did Hmong refugees bring to the U.S.? Well, think about what they had when they came here. In the data, we can identify recent arrivals in the U.S. as people who say they have been in the U.S. for 0 to 5 years. So we're going to think of them as new immigrants. What do we see with Hmong refugees? Well, we see they had very low levels of human capital. For example, if we look at recently arrived working age Hmong men, 29% of them reported they had no education. It's a very high percentage. 59% said that they either did not speak English at all or they did not speak English well. So English language fluency was a very low level. Among Hmong women, working age Hmong women, 43% said they had no education. 68% said they did not speak English well. So very low levels of human capital. So human capital endowments are very, very low for Hmong refugees. about the lowest of any immigrant or refugee groups. We've looked at all kinds of different refugee groups and immigrant groups, and Hmong refugees rank just about the lowest among all groups. It's very interesting, a story for another day. The other group that ranks very low in these indicators is immigrants from Mexico. It's a very, very different story, but we see similar statistics for Mexican American immigrants, similar to what we see for Hmong Americans. That's interesting. Economists have studied Mexican American immigrants extensively, more than Hmong immigrants. So, very little human capital. So it's hard for Hmong refugees to get jobs. When they got jobs, they tend to be low-skilled jobs, low-paying jobs. Wages were low. Hmong refugees struggled in the labor market. Now, next slide, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of numbers, because that's what I have and that's what I do. I like a whole bunch of numbers. So get ready to squint, but I'll try to lead you through all the numbers here. Oh my gosh. Here we're comparing Hmong refugees with a number of other groups. Some other Southeast Asian refugees, other refugees from Laos, but not Hmong, refugees from Cambodia, Vietnamese immigrants, and then kind of a random sample of other groups. Born in Somalia, born in Burma, Myanmar. We had a lot of refugees from Burma in recent decades. Iraq, Mexico, China, very different country. Let's throw it in the list. Born in the OECD. So here, let's compare Hmong refugees with Canadians and Europeans coming to the US. Let's focus here on the recent immigrants, 0 to 5 years in the US. We got a bunch of indicators here. What do we see? Years of education. Number of years of education for Hmong refugees when they get here, 7 years. That's lower than other Southeast Asian immigrants and much lower than OECD immigrants. English language fluency, low English. Did they say they don't speak English well? Well, 62% for recent Hmong immigrants. That's higher than the percentage for any other group except Mexican American immigrants. Not much education, don't speak English well. So what do we see as a result here? Well, labor force participation rates, very, very low. Among recent Hmong immigrants, only 46% were working. Very, very low. For other groups, we have 60, 70% for other Southeast Asian refugees, 88%, 90% for other refugees and immigrants. Only 46% of Hmong immigrants were working. Very, very low labor force participation. 50% were living in poverty. Public assistance income was 36% of their total income. So they relied very heavily on public assistance. Comparing with the other groups here, Hmong Americans came here with less human capital and struggled to get jobs. What if we look at people who did get jobs? Here we have even smaller print. You got to squint harder. But here, just looking at working people, we see that recent immigrants had low incomes, lower than most other groups. Among the working people, they had a little more education, better language skills than the broader Hmong American group, because these are people who got jobs. So of course they're kind of self-selected here. They speak English a little better on average, a little more education. An interesting variable here, occupational status. What kinds of jobs do they get? Well, our data provides occupations for everybody who's working. And there's a variable that maps occupation into a score, an occupational status score. This is kind of a crude measure, but it's interesting. This occupational score goes from 0 to 100. Wow, you can't see this, but the low scoring occupations are things like farm laborers get a score of 6. High scoring dentists, should have been a dentist instead of an economist, with a 96. But map occupations into scores. And then we can see what kinds of jobs people were getting. The average occupational status for Hmong refugees, 28.7. That's lower than most of the other groups here, way lower than the Canadians and Europeans. So people are getting low-skilled jobs. Even for those who were working, 38% were living in poverty. 6.5% of their income was public assistance. That's way higher than any other group here. So Hmong refugees came with lower levels of human capital, and it was difficult to gain traction after they arrived here. They struggled in the labor market, which is understandable. Now, looking back at this, we got this column here, recent immigrants. We got a column here also that looks at immigrants, refugees, after they've been here 10 years longer. What if they've been here 11 to 15 years? We see some progress here. Hmong Americans, do they have low English skills? Well, a smaller percentage say they don't speak English well. So that's good. Labor force participation rates, higher. Still not high. Only 68% of here Hmong men said that they were working after they had been here 11 to 15 years. That's still lower than other groups, still struggles, but some improvement. Here's a chart I really like. I think this is a great picture of the improvement. What do we have here? Here we're looking at median household income. The red line here is median inflation-adjusted household income for all American households. We see that in the 1980 census, 1990, 2000, and then after that, inflation-adjusted median household income was rising for a while and then kind of flattened out. So here's our standard for Americans. What about Hmong households? Well, here are the figures from our data for Hmong households. I got a 95% confidence interval on our estimates here. But of course, we see that Hmong households in 1980 started off way below other American households in terms of median household income. And their progress was pretty fast until around 2005. Median household income for Hmong families just about matched the median for all American households. That's pretty spectacular progress. That's really interesting. Now, there's a qualification here. Hmong households tend to have more people in them than other American households. Hmong families tend to have more children. So if you look at per capita income, you would see that Hmong people are still ranking lower per capita than other Americans. But household income caught up with the mainstream by about 2005. So there's amazing progress there. What caused that progress? What can we attribute that to? Well, it was growth in human capital. Over time, people's English language skills got a little bit better. Probably most important in the data is that they had more work experience. With more work experience, people tend to be more productive in the job, they get promotions. Probably that explains a lot here. What about education? Well, if we look at the data, Hmong adults, the refugees, the first generation, did not acquire a whole lot more education. So that doesn't really explain very much here. But households got higher incomes, partly because they had more human capital. Yeah, so that makes sense. There's a consequence here that follows, and it makes sense. With more human capital, then we see in the data that People are more likely to work. They're more likely to get higher wages. They work more hours per year. That follows from having more human capital. And so, of course, then their household income is higher. So that all makes sense. We can see where this progress comes from. There's another interesting thing that we see in the data. In the 1990s, more Hmong women entered the labor force. When Hmong families first came to the U.S., it was unlikely that Hmong women would work. In the 1990s, we saw that more Hmong women were entering the labor force, and so households had more earners than they had before. And of course, that's going to help increase median household income. So, these are factors that can account for it. Now, there's another factor that we can add in here that's fascinating and deserves a lot more attention by scholars. We're talking about increases in human capital here. What about increases in social capital? Social capital refers to the benefits of social networking and communities. And among Americans, that's really, really important. So this takes us into a question of the growth of Hmong American communities, Hmong American enclaves, and question of secondary migration for Hmong people. Just very quickly here, an overview of migration, secondary migration among Hmong Americans. Where a refugee family gets located in the U.S. is determined by international refugee agencies and by the federal government and by non-governmental resettlement agencies like Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which brings lots of Hmong refugees to the Twin Cities, where they've never seen snow before, and suddenly they're dealing with Minnesota winters. Hmong refugees came to Minnesota because an agency that was resettling refugees happened to have strong ties in Minnesota. So refugees end up in certain cities because of that. Now, back in the early years, after 1975, federal government tried to scatter refugees all across the country, thinking we don't want to burden any communities with a whole lot of refugees. So if you look at the data, and we have the data, Hmong refugees lived all over the place in 1980 and 1990, scattered all over the place. After a while, the government kind of changed the way they settled refugees, started getting some communities in places like the Twin Cities, where there were some Hmong people, and local government communities were providing support. So the government would put more refugees there. Also, you'd have Hmong families living in the U.S., and they could support immigration for family members. They could say, hey, okay, we're living in the Twin Cities. We will host our cousins and aunts and uncles. So, we started to see some consolidation here. And after a while, Hmong families started moving around. They moved from their scattered locations all over the place and built Hmong communities. As Erica said, Hmong families have mostly ended up in California, Minnesota, and Wisconsin today. The biggest concentration, biggest metropolitan concentration is in the Twin Cities, about 20% of Hmong Americans. Big Hmong communities in Fresno, California, Sacramento, and then a lot of communities around the country, including Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I made this list long enough that we could get Eau Claire on the list. So what does this say about economic progress? We're seeing big Hmong communities being built. Well, does that promote economic progress? Does that help Hmong families be more successful? Well, again, let's look at what the scholarly literature says about this. Academic literature gives us kind of mixed messages. Some studies that have been done of ethnic enclaves have said ethnic enclaves are good for economic progress because immigrants have more opportunities in an ethnic enclave. Some other studies have said bad for economic progress because in an ethnic enclave, maybe wages tend to be lower and there are fewer incentives to learn English and to maybe get education. And so, maybe progress is slower. So mixed messages. What do we see in our data? We controlled for other kinds of things and looked at the relationship between size of the Hmong community and economic outcomes. And we see some evidence that economic outcomes are a little bit worse in bigger Hmong communities. In the Twin Cities and Fresno and Sacramento, seems that people aren't doing quite as well in terms of average wages, occupational status, and other kinds of indicators, which is really interesting. This suggests that Hmong Americans are moving to these places not to get better jobs and higher pay, but they're moving to these places like the Twin Cities or Fresno for other reasons. They want to be with family, and families who need family support, maybe with a lot of kids or disabled family members or elderly family members, they maybe want to move to a place with more Hmong Americans where they can find more social support. There's also some evidence that in bigger communities, California in particular, maybe public assistance support is more generous. And so maybe families that would have more trouble maybe working, earning high salaries, they might choose to move to Fresno or Sacramento in order to get more generous public assistance support. Very interesting. Interesting question. Why have Hmong families moved the way they have? Why have they done this? Very quickly, another aspect here. We're talking about first-generation Hmong refugees. What about the second generation? Hmong families started coming to the U.S. around 1975. That was, 47 years ago. There were Hmong children born in 1975 in the U.S., they're U.S. citizens, who now could be 47 years old. And in our data, we can see how they're doing. So what do we see there? What do we see in the data? How is the second generation doing? What do we expect to see? Again, let's think about what the literature tells us. Literature tells us a couple of things. It tells us that second-generation immigrants tend to do really well. They do a lot better than their immigrant parents, which makes sense. And second-generation immigrants actually, on average, tend to do better than native-born whites. So that's a fascinating result. Immigrants do well. It calls to mind, Hamilton, and we should talk about how, immigrants are great. They are. Evidence shows that how second-generation immigrants do, children of first-generation immigrants, how they do is correlated with how their parents did. So if the parents have less human capital and if they struggle in the labor market, we would expect that their children are going to tend to have less human capital and maybe also struggle in relative terms in the labor market. So what do we think about second-generation Hmong? Well, the parents struggled in the labor market. They had less human capital. These results from the literature might say we would expect that second-generation Hmong Americans might struggle in the labor market. There are a couple of paradigms that come from the academic literature. Sociologists have come up with what they call segmented assimilation theory, which says that immigrant groups are going to follow different assimilation paths, some good, some not so good, based upon what they had when they came here And based on the reception they received here, what were their living standards like in the US? Did they face a lot of discrimination? Did they have a lot of barriers? Based on this kind of idea, you might expect that second-generation Hmong Americans might struggle because, again, their parents struggled. The sociologists who promoted this theory would say, well, maybe Hmong Americans might follow a path of what they call downward assimilation. They might not be successful. The sociologists who promoted this kind of theory talked about small samples of Hmong Americans. And they found something interesting. They found that despite possible predictions of downward assimilation, second-generation Hmong Americans were doing surprisingly well in their sample. And they touched on this, although they didn't have a lot of data on Hmong Americans. I've got a lot of data on second-generation Hmong Americans, so we can update that. But there's some interesting stuff. Another paradigm is what's called the model minority hypothesis. Model minority hypothesis, you probably heard about this. It says that, well, Asian Americans are overachievers. If we look at the data, we see that indeed average incomes for Asian Americans are significantly higher than average incomes for any other groups in the US. Asian Americans, on average, very, very successful. And a lot of sociologists who think that there is really something to this, they say, well, there's something special about Asian culture that leads to that success. There's some kind of magic cultural factor for Asian Americans that leads to that kind of success. Now, other scholars are very critical of this. For one thing, they say, well, yeah, Asian Americans, you're lumping together so many different groups. This doesn't make any sense. You're lumping together Asian Indians with everybody. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And many scholars have pointed out that the model minority hypothesis actually can promote discrimination against Asian Americans by setting expectations so high and setting Asian Americans up for failure if they are not spectacularly successful. But here we get some hypotheses. What do we see in our data? Second-generation Hmong Americans, we can compare them with native-born white adults. Broad results here. We see that Hmong Americans and other Southeast Asian second-generation adults have done way better than their parents. We saw that Southeast Asian refugees struggled in the first generation. Their children are doing way better. Interesting to see. Vietnamese American adults, second generation, are doing spectacularly well. They're going to feed into the model minority paradigm. They're doing really, really well, doing better than white Americans on average. Other Southeast Asian American second generation adults, including Hmong Americans, are doing less well in terms of wages and earnings than native-born whites. Now, when we look at these kinds of things, there's a statistical problem here. Comparing Hmong Americans with whites. Well, Hmong Americans came to the U.S. more recently, so our Hmong American second-generation cohort has a lower average age. They're a younger cohort than white Americans. So we have to adjust for age here, and we have to adjust for other kinds of things. Something we'd like to know is, if we adjust for age, if we hold other things constant, how are Hmong Americans doing relative to whites and other groups in the U.S.? Is there evidence of discrimination? Is there evidence of model minority hypothesis at work? What do we see here? So in our research, we've done a couple of things. We've controlled for age. Do a model where we look at wages, hourly wages, see how that depends on age. We can here control for the fact that our our Southeast Asian cohort is younger than whites. For men, we see that Vietnamese do better than white men, and Southeast Asian second-generation adults, men, do less well than whites and others. Second generation is, not catching up with whites. But we see something interesting if we look at second-generation Southeast Asian women. Here, white women, their age profile is here, and we see that Hmong women are, within the confidence interval with white women there and other Southeast Asian women, young Southeast Asian American women are doing really well, doing better than men relative to whites and others. Really interesting. Hmong women, other Southeast Asian second-generation women are doing well. We can look at this another way. Let's control for education and age and the region of the country where they live and a whole bunch of other variables. Let's hold other things constant and see what kinds of comparisons we get across different groups. So here we're going to look at Hmong women and other women from whose parents were born in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and white US-born women. Look at women who have a high school education. Look at women who have a college education. We get predictions of what their wages would be. Let's look at high school educated women. Here are white women. Here are estimates here, and then we have confidence intervals here. We see that Southeast Asian American women, the high school education, are doing better than native-born white women. Again, Southeast Asian American women, including Hmong women, are doing really well. What do they have a college education? Well, they're white women, and we see that most Southeast Asian second-generation women are doing better than white women. Hmong women fall behind a little bit among college educated. Now, why is that? That's an interesting thing. If you look at occupations of these Hmong women and occupations of others here, we see that college-educated Hmong women are more likely to go into occupations like social work or teaching or community-directed occupations, which unfortunately tend not to pay so well. Social workers should get paid better than all the rest of us, but they aren't. Teachers should get paid higher. Hmong women tend to go into those kinds of fields. Vietnamese women tend to go more likely into STEM fields. So the return on a college education is high for Vietnamese women, not so high for Hmong women, but they're still doing well. Hmong men, again, high school educated, college educated, they tend to do less well than white native-born men. There's an interesting puzzle there. Why are Hmong women so relatively successful in the second generation and more relatively successful than Hmong men? There's an interesting topic there for future research. There's so much we could say about this. There's so many other interesting aspects here, but we can't go on for forever, although I would like to. What questions do you have?
Jump up here and just invite our online viewers. If you have questions, you can email them to orsp@uwec.edu. It's orsp@uwec.edu, and we will read them to Dr. Carroll. And Dr. Carroll, if you would not mind repeating questions from the audience so
Okay,
that the
sure.
online viewers can hear them.
Sounds good. Yes, ma'am.
On those last set of comparisons of various Southeast Asian nationalities to the white men and women, were the white men and women second generation white immigrants?
No, they were native-born whites, and I didn't have information on whether they were immigrants or not. So the white sample there. Oh, and I should have repeated the question. When we look at whites here in this comparison, are these second-generation immigrant whites? Yeah. They are not in general. They are just native-born, U.S.-born whites. Some of them would be second-generation immigrants, but I don't have any information about where their parents were born. I wish we had that variable in the data. Oh, that would be wonderful if we knew where mom and dad were born.
Immigration status alone may be affecting some of these variables.
Yeah, among this cohort here, some of them would be second-generation immigrants. You would expect that they would be doing better than other whites based on other previous kinds of research results. Yeah, that's a good question. I wish we had data on that. Yeah, Stephen.
What is the proportion of like the people who go to college? Like,
yeah. So yeah, what proportions of these groups do go to college? I don't remember the figures right offhand. I've got the figures in an article that was written here, but Vietnamese are much more likely to go to college. Among Vietnamese adults, Vietnamese American adults, second generation, something like 50% of them go to college, which is partly a result of the fact that they have very, very high returns to a college education. You go to college and you do very, very well. And again, Vietnamese Americans tend to go into STEM fields, and so they have very high returns there, and they have high rates of college education. I don't remember what the rates of college attendance are for the Southeast Asians as compared with the whites. Among women, I think a pretty high percentage go to college, but I don't remember exactly how that compares with white women. I've got that in an article. Yeah, you can read all about it in one of the articles. Yeah. Yes, Maria.
Do you have the information about where do those immigrants come from, urban areas versus rural areas? Because it's my understanding that most Hmong refugees come from rural areas, whereas some of the other refugees may come from urban areas.
Yeah. So yeah, where do refugees come from? Urban areas or rural areas? You're thinking about where they came from in Laos and their origins?
Vietnamese in particular. Some of those Vietnamese may come from Hong Kong, for instance.
Yeah, we have a lot of information about that. We know what country they come from. So if somebody comes through Hong Kong, we have that in the data.
I did notice you didn't have born in Vietnam, you have Vietnamese. So I'm thinking that maybe they were born somewhere else since they are so.
And in doing this research, I've done things both ways, and I don't really remember which way I did it for the tables that you're seeing here. I've looked at the data for people born in Vietnam, and also looked at data for people who identified as Vietnamese, who might have been born someplace else. And you can look at the data both ways. You're raising really, really important questions, rural versus urban. Yeah, Hmong refugees, tended to come from very rural areas. They did slash and burn agriculture in the mountains of Laos, and not urbanized. Other Laotians, not Hmong, would tend to be more urban. Lowland Lao, and would tend to be more urban. Cambodians, I'm not sure. Vietnamese, more likely to be urban. And that means that people who are more urban maybe would come with more human capital. And that might explain some of the differences we see here. That might be an important factor that explains why Vietnamese first-generation refugees and also second-generation Vietnamese Americans have done so well, because maybe they had urban roots in Vietnam. That would make a big, big difference.
We are over time. Let's thank Dr. Carroll, and if you have questions, I'm sure he'll be happy to stick around to take those.
So, thank you very much. Thanks for coming.